All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Klaas Sailors. This is Klaas in 60 Seconds live on Facebook, where we have about 15, 20-minute conversations with really interesting folks talking about the intersections between what they do and what we do at Family Promise as the leading national organization addressing family homelessness. And I want to wish everyone out there the best wishes for Passover, which has just come by, and obviously Good Friday, Easter, for all those who celebrate those holidays. My guest today is a really interesting person. I've known him for a little while. We've talked a number of times about his specific area of focus. Casey Trupin is the director of youth homelessness at the Raikes Foundaiton up in Seattle. You'll know that if you see the pictures of various Seattle Mariners behind him. But the issue of youth homelessness obviously overlaps with our work. They focus particularly on unattached youth who are experiencing homelessness. But the bottom line is we agree on the concept that when children experience housing instability, you're robbing them of their future. And how do we address that, right? What do we know about youth homelessness, and what should we be doing? So I'm going to invite Casey on. We're going to have a conversation about that. And there he is. Casey, how are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me today.
Good. I think the place to start, right? We titled this, What We Know, What We Should Be Doing. You are one of the preeminent experts on youth homelessness. So why don't you give sort of an overview of youth homelessness and how big of a problem it is?
Yeah, I think that's historically been the subject of a lot of debate, how big it is, and how big a problem it is, and how it relates to, all of the other issues that young people and families face. But I think in the recent years, we've gotten a better grasp on that thanks to some groundbreaking research by Chapin Hall at University of Chicago called Voices of Youth Count. And I think, the best estimate we have now is that about 4.2 million young people experience homelessness every year. And that includes minors ages 13 to 18, and then young adults 18 to 24. So it's a pretty significant problem. And I think if we thought of other populations that had more than 4 million young people involved, we would give it a lot more attention than I think we do currently.
Yeah, no, I agree. And of that number, right, we have this intersection because we work with families experiencing homelessness, which means we're primarily working with youth, but we're working with them in family units. So of that number, do you know how many are unattached youth as opposed to youth in family units?
Well, it's a tough number to put their finger on, and I think what Chapin Hall established was that there is a big intersection between young people who are on their own and young people in families, and that often young people cycle in and out of being physically with their families. So it's hard to know exactly how many of those experience unaccompanied youth homelessness at any given time, but it's a pretty significant number within that, and we know that. Again, it's really depends on when you ask the question about what's the status of a young person right now. Is the answer you get. We just know that there's a huge overlap.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I think it's something that we also align on is overall the sort of frustrations we have with defining homelessness so narrowly that most people who are experiencing housing instability are cycling from being doubled up to being maybe successfully housed, to being in their cars, to being in motels, to being in shelters. Yet, depending on who's counting, they're not always counted the same way. And the underlying issue is just that essential instability that exists. So what's your assessment of what we're currently doing about youth homelessness, and is it working?
Yeah, I think certainly our communities have been working on this issue for decades and decades. It's not a new phenomenon, and certainly one that caught public attention, for a long time with Oscar-winning movies, and even before that, I think in international context. I mean, even to some extent, Charles Dickens wrote about it. And the focus has always, I think, been, or for a long time, been on when the problem gets serious enough, then what do we do? And I think the first and most maybe ubiquitous response has certainly been to provide shelters, because it's a humane response. It's the most direct response that young people don't have shelter over their heads, and we need to take care of. People need to have stability so that they can address all of the other issues that are going on. We don't have enough. Clearly, every single indicator tells us, in shelters and drop-in centers, in terms of what we do in the crisis response system, we aren't even doing close to enough to address that large number of young people experiencing homelessness. We have outreach teams in many communities, and so I think that that's what communities have been doing, and that's problematic, certainly for rural communities where you just can't string enough money together for a shelter. And we've seen innovations come out of communities where they can't string together a shelter. Things like host homes, where people are opening up a room, not foster care, but a temporary, offering of a room for a period of time while young people make the connections and get on their feet. Some of those rural communities have, I think, through not being able to go the traditional route, have come up with sometimes fantastic trauma-informed responses like host homes. So we have this crisis response, and I think we also have seen innovations in schools, where schools have at times understood that this is a barrier to them accomplishing what their primary motivation is. So you see, whether it's homeless liaisons within schools or school districts, you've seen school housing partnerships. And then, I think there's less and less as you get further away from young people who are experience the kind of most visible forms of unsheltered homelessness, which I think is a problem.
Yeah, and you talked about schools, and we've seen some really incredible work on high schools and some colleges too, just because they have actually a pretty extensive amount of resources that can ameliorate some of the human needs, and it makes a world of sense to make those connections. And talking about the kind of opening up the homes and everything too. I know one of the big factors with youth homelessness, right? You have a disproportionate number of youth who are LGBTQ and who are youth of color, and that can be an often simple solution, because these are youth that have been kicked out of their current living arrangements, and can be offered a room somewhere else. Have you seen? You talked a little bit about that. Like, what are some of the most interesting elements you've seen out of these programs, and do we have any way to scale that up?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we certainly, your point about disproportionate representation of youth who are LGBTQ and youth of color, and that's not an easy solution, because we see that same disproportionate representation in the other systems, the systems that might be referred to as upstream systems, where young people are being not well served in those systems, whether it's schools or the criminal legal system or child welfare. And so sometimes by the time a young person ends up in the homelessness system, they cycled through these other systems that are racialized, that have been built on inequitable foundations that really were intentionally racist and now functionally racist. And so they're incredibly traumatizing to young people. And then if our response is then to address homelessness and think that we're going to address the massive trauma that a young person has experienced and the racism that they've experienced, or the homophobia or the transphobia, and that we're going to fix that solely with a crisis response system, we're really doing a disservice to young people. And young people and families have said this all along, and I think we're just starting to listen in philanthropy and in government, that they've said, look, there were all these opportunities where somebody or some system could have intervened to support me, and they just didn't, because it wasn't bad enough. And we cannot any longer, I think both the nation's racial reckoning and COVID have taught us that we cannot operate that way. We're really damaging a whole generation of young people. We're letting families that really could be supported go, destroying the opportunity for young people to have connections to their families. So what's working? I think there are some great programs out there that are doing family reconciliation, that are supporting young people, whether the issue is, and usually it's a number of issues, parental behavioral health issues, substance use, conflict over the young person's sexual orientation or gender identity. It could be, a million things, often mixed in with poverty. But we don't offer a lot to families when that's happening. And we wait until young people end up homeless. And so I've seen a lot more offers of, everything from diversion, figuring out what the issue is early on and offering flexible cash. Counseling for young people and their families that is truly youth-centered and trauma-informed. Legal services have been really effective. We've seen that in our community for young people and their families, everything from eviction prevention to holistic legal representation of young people, regardless of what system they're in. I think education supports that come through schools are just, when they're done well, they are incredibly fantastic. So those are some of the things that need to be, I think, scaled. And I think we need to do a way better job of scaling up true prevention. And that's tough because I don't think most of the upstream systems, they're not focused on preventing youth homelessness as integral to what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, those are great points. And I just want to echo something I think you referred to too, which is having worked in this sector for a long time, I've always been impressed, really particularly impressed with the McKinney-Vento folks at schools. I think schools have shown themselves to be real champions. Not every school, but as a kind of a body, I think it's really impressive how much schools have tried to lean in on homelessness. And you and I had conversations about, you were positing the theory, which I think is absolutely accurate, that if we can practice diversion with families, with teens, particularly with older teens, they are much more likely to stay together than if we bring them into shelter, because a family going to shelter, a 17-year-old, is going to have some real aversions to it and have what seem viable options outside of it that often will actually weaken their supports. And I think one of the key elements with all of this is, there's such a profound human toll, but I've seen the studies that have shown that adults experiencing homelessness, it's anywhere from like 25 to 40% experience homelessness at some point as children or youth. And, we're just creating this system where we're just perpetuating. And as you said, all these upstream areas, if we think of the amount of investment, the amount of money it costs to allow all those children end up to grow up with all of the deficits that housing instability have caused and that higher likelihood of homelessness, how much that costs us, if we could just push that upstream, it would be such a phenomenal cost savings.
There's no doubt in my mind about that. We have we have both anecdotal data, I think, as you refer, and absolute clear data that supports that. And I think you go way downstream, to the worst outcome of young people dying. The suicide rates among young people experiencing homelessness are off the charts. Go a little bit more upstream. I've been to our one of our state prisons a lot, where there's a group of inmates who are serving 15 years to life, and they all were in foster care. And the other thing that they all have in common is that all of them experienced a period of homelessness. So you want to reduce the prison size, you need to address youth homelessness. You go a little more upstream, and as you mentioned, adults who are quote unquote chronically homeless have a significant proportion of them experience homelessness as young people. Keep going upstream. What's the number one path into young adult homelessness? It's youth homelessness. So, and it's failure to graduate from high school. So I think you want to reduce chronic homelessness. You got to address youth and young adult homelessness. You want to reduce prison population. You've got to get a handle on this. But people need to make those connections, because I think that policymakers for far too long, because the population is so invisible, have not focused on this. And because there is no ownership over this population, there is ownership over foster care, over juvenile justice, over school outcomes. But who owns the issue of youth homelessness? It fits so neatly in between all these systems that unless government owns this and it's clear who owns it, it's not going to happen. That's one of the things that the Raikes Foundation has supported, is making sure that whatever level of government, municipal, county, COC, state or federal, you got to have point people. You got to have somebody within government who is advocating for this, and who is also the target for the frenemies, the external advocates as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think of our Western Regional Director, not far from you in Portland, her husband, I've stole this line from her husband. We focus so much on veterans' homelessness, but our policies make children veterans of homelessness. You know, it's so frustrating. And let me ask you this, you know, on a positive note, and maybe I'm wrong, but I have the perception that I think we've made some real progress on, for example, youth aging out of foster care, which 20 years ago was just a dreadful black hole with no services and all of these really terrible outcomes. And I feel like we put some attention to that. We made some progress. So I guess first off, you can tell me whether I'm right or if I'm just being I'm misguided. And if I am right, is there anything in that we could then transfer over to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think you are right. I think this has been a high area of focus in the especially in the last 10 years, that young people, and there's a specific population of young people who interact with foster care, those who didn't end up with a permanent home by the time they turned 18, that we focused on because the case has been made rightfully so that we have some responsibility. We remove these young people from their family of origin, and we did not successfully find another, or either reunify them, which is the main goal of foster care, or find a forever family for them. So the argument was made and became federal law after it was, done in a couple of states, that we should be able to provide them with support from ages 18 to 21. That has made a difference by some studies, not as much of a difference, but it's clear that population is at high risk for youth homelessness. And I think some data coming out of California in particular indicates that providing money specifically for housing, plus case management, plus other connections, plus ongoing, access to health insurance really does make a difference in terms of homelessness. But I think what we've forgotten about. So what we've forgotten about is all these young people who have interactions with foster care and do end up getting permanency. And there's a big population, but end up for a variety of reasons of trauma, of just normal adolescence, that the home doesn't work out and they end up on the streets during adolescence, or 18, 19, 20. The other thing that you had asked was, what lessons can we take from this? And I'd say two. One is, we really need to support young people who have had instability that have been caused by the failure of our systems. We need to support them in their young adult lives, and we need to support them financially and with other supports if we're really going to get a hold on a hold of homelessness. So what happens if a young person is adopted and then the home falls apart at 16 or 17. I represented a lot of those young people. It was so hard to get services for them, not because they didn't want it, but because the system was set up only to serve people who were still in a system. So we have to make sure that a young person coming out of a juvenile justice setting or just in a school has access to services, diversion, flexible funding, case management, no matter what, and that they have a right to that. That is really part and parcel, I think, of a right to housing. And the second lesson learned, I think, is that we really need to apply a data analysis to this. Because one thing we did in advocating for youth aging out of foster care is we largely forgot the youth who didn't age out of foster care, but who form just as big a group, if not bigger, in terms of youth homelessness. And those young people, again, who were adopted, reunified, ended up in a kinship care placement and ended up homeless because of the trauma and those systems as well. So we really need to, and I'll give you a good example of this. And this I think shows my own kind of failure in this area. Is we focused, when we talk about the systems that interact with youth homelessness, we talk about schools, child welfare, and the juvenile and adult criminal justice system. When Washington State looked at the data in terms of what were the interactions with public systems of care, the number one system that they found was hospitals, that it was inpatient hospitalization for substance use disorder, or for behavioral health, mental health issues, that hospitals and behavioral health settings were young people were leaving there and ending up homeless within 6 to 12 months. and at a significant rate. And we really had not done anything to focus on that population.
Really interesting, and it goes to how important. Yeah, and this is something we're grappling with too. Is what are some of those predictive elements, right? How do we figure out ahead of time so we can see what are the interventions, who are the people at the highest vulnerability, in a real holistic way, not using a VSPDAT, which is not maybe the best instrument. So let me ask you two more questions. So talk a little bit about. Well, I'll ask you 3 more questions. I'll make them quick. Talk a little bit about Raikes Foundaiton, right? What you are, what you do, and then I got 2 more questions I want to ask you.
Great, yeah. So I'll try and be brief. We're a family foundation founded by Jeff and Trisha Raikes, and who has in part been focused on youth homelessness and also education and other areas. Our focus has grown as our understanding of the issue has grown from focusing really just in our backyard in King County, Washington, and just in crisis response to really what are the upstream opportunities that we can invest in that will help young people, as many young people, not experience homelessness as possible, and then focusing on the federal, state, and local levels. So we tend to invest in what we consider to be system reforms, and we think of that as a number of different areas. One, like I said earlier, government has to own this. So what can we do to make sure that government owns this? 2, you got to have a robust external advocacy structure. So we're funding advocates, and especially those advocates who have young people at the fore, young people who have lived expertise. And then you got to have a shared plan. So we invest in areas where communities are creating a shared plan. We invest in the data structure that's going to be necessary, like I referred to earlier, to actually figure out who's being affected, making sure you're focused on serving people who are most affected in the right way, young people of color, young people who are LGBTQ primarily, and then are you assessing where there are opportunities to intervene? The third area we think every community obviously needs is the adequate array of services that are data supported. And we tend not to invest in those except where there's a gap and where government can't move quickly enough, or the providers have to make the case for government to fund that. We think primarily that's the responsibility of government, and they tend not to be doing that. But so we've invested in those kind of 3 areas. And then substantively, we are trying to invest more in prevention. We focus on student homelessness. We focus on crisis response system, and then what's the kind of field building and advocacy structure that needs to be there to have a coordinated system that actually addresses youth homelessness.
Yeah, and it's great work that you do, and a great work that Chapin Hall. I kind of think of you and Matt Morton as sort of comrades in arms. It's some tremendous work being done in this field, and I also just want to make a note. We apparently are having real intermittent clouds here because I keep getting lit up and then lit down, lit up and lit down. So it's exterior lighting. It's not me doing some dramatic lighting here.
It's the impact of interviewing somebody from Seattle. The weather tends to somehow, go through the interwebs and to whoever's interviewing.
So the next question is related to this. I'm of the opinion the American Rescue Plan is a pretty impressive piece of legislation, all things considered. But if you could have the ear of somebody in the administration, who would that be, and what would be the important message that you would tell them of what they need to do?
Yeah, I think you go right to the top, right? It's the president and the vice president. I think I would first make the case that youth homelessness is somewhat the bellwether of all these broken systems, and if we can fix youth homelessness, we're going to result in fixing a lot of other issues that we are struggling with, or at least making a lot of headway. To a large extent, the school to prison pipeline impacts youth homelessness. The inequities in the juvenile justice system. How families are doing in general, having healthy families. I would say to them, as much as we can, let's blow up these systems. Let's look and see where there are the healthiest structures that actually support families and young people early on, and do it in a way that actually prevents them from experiencing homelessness in the beginning. We've looked at a program in Australia that basically does a universal assessment of young people, and says, and then refers them to services before they end up homeless. And that had a 40% reduction of young people entering the crisis response system. So I would say, have the federal government put its flag in the ground and say, we're gonna ramp up prevention substantially, and we're going to look for those investments that are based in community, that are driven by community, that are racially equitable, and we're going to start investing in this and see how much we can reduce this. And then we're also going to support crisis response efforts that are driving the number down in a big way. This is the moment. I think the American Rescue Plan was a good example of that we can continue kind of putting in a little money for a little, over a long period of time, and then wondering why we're spending a lot of money on the back end. Let's not do that. Let's make sure that everybody has access to affordable housing. Let's make sure that families have access to the services they need at the time they need it. And let's connect prevention to a bunch of other things that we're trying to solve that we know it's connected to, and put down not only a bunch of money, but some of let's invest in the best minds in that space. And first in that is the young people who've experienced it themselves. And then you add in some brilliant minds from all of these sectors like Matt Morton and like others who are able to say, you invest in these 10 things, you're going to see a 50-60% reduction in youth homelessness and young people who aren't traumatized like we're allowing them to be right now.
Yeah, and then see 10 years out some incredible economic outcomes from that, because you've got productive people, you've got a fully engaged citizenry, you've got competent people for a rapidly changing workforce. I mean, like, again, it's kind of crass because it's about people, but systemically, it's just. So last question, and I've kept you on really long because I'm just loving everything you're saying, and I agree with everything you're saying. The last question, right? We just had opening day, except for the Mets, of course, who once we look like we have a team that could win, we are now not allowed to play. So you're a Mariners fan. You've enjoyed some of our cast hosts like Rick Sweet and Lenny Randall and Steve Henderson and so on. But who's your favorite all-time Mariner and why?
Ooh, that's a really tough question. Well, I got Edgar Martinez over my shoulder. So and I named my wife and I named our dog after Edgar. So Edgar is way up there. But it'd be hard to overlook Ken Griffey Jr. As well. And I would say Ichiro is an all-time favorite. And they're all three exceptionally different. And if I were to tie it to youth homelessness, I would say you need all three of those typologies to address youth homelessness. You need the kind of steady and slow Edgar Martinez who can be consistent. You need the person who sees some joy in this work, like Ken Griffey Jr. And you need the absolute all-star like Ichiro, who's gonna drive in all the runs, who's gonna get on base every time, who's gonna hustle. That's the Mariners. Now you would hope for a different outcome than the Mariners had, and I think we're like, or the Mets arguably have had. But listen, we're undefeated. The Mariners are undefeated after opening night. We're top of the league. There's nothing but wins ahead, so I'm gonna just count on them.
Yeah, and just speaking about youth too, you have that youth from Wisconsin that we gave you, who's going to be the next Mike Trout. So,
Yes.
And meanwhile, we have a guy who's been suspended for the season.
Right. We don't refer to anybody as the next Mike Trout because we try not to recognize talent on other teams. But I get the sentiment of what you're saying.
All right, Casey, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Keep up doing the fantastic work. I believe you're going to be speaking at our Innovation Summit. I think you're on one of our panels, maybe, right? Am I correct on that?
That's right.
So folks, you get more of Casey in a month and a half.
Watch out. Thanks so much for having me. It's been an absolute blast.
Thanks, Casey. Take care.